shift, the stakes are high. The Mag breaks it down, no need to sigh. From EU rules to global news, Reg with Meg, your trusted views.
Welcome back to Reg with Meg. I'm your host, Tiffany Brown, and in today's episode, we're wrapping up 2025 and looking ahead to what 2026 holds for medical device and IVD manufacturers around the world. Joining me today is Darryl Wisdahl, Director of Consulting Services at MedEnvoy, who works closely with manufacturers navigating complex global regulatory requirements. Darryl will break down the most impactful regulatory changes from 2025 and what's coming next in 2026. So let's dive in. So Darryl, the first question I have for you is, what were the most impactful medical device regulatory changes in 2025 for medical device and IVD manufacturers?
I think there are a couple things that were issued in 2025 that are very important. One was the new regulation on AI and how that relates to products. I think manufacturers of AI devices are it's absolutely necessary for them to read through that regulation and understand what's required. I think one of the other impactful changes is the swissdamed requirements for registering in there, and the news that EUDAMED will come online next year in May. Those are really big pieces of news. There's one more piece of news for 2025 that's supposed to be happening, and there's supposed to be a report coming out on the MDR and the IVDR from one of the study groups. It was mentioned in the Pittsburgh RAPS conference that this was coming, but as of right now, we haven't seen anything published. I'm really looking forward to seeing this. What's going to come out of this is some recommendations, changes. As far as I can tell, the recommendations for changes will not be no changes to the regulation itself, but they're just kind of setting the stage for how changes can be implemented. And there's a lot of pushback right now on this process, even so much as looking at moving away from having each country have their own competent authority reviewing this and go to more of a EU-wide approval. But I don't think that'll necessarily happen.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot going on this year for sure. Speaking on that, what do you think about how the MDR IVDR landscape has evolved this year? And do you foresee any pain points heading into 2026?
I think first and foremost, we need to look at the IVDR and how the timeline for everything being completed for class B, C, and D devices, that timeline is slipping away quickly. And manufacturers, their ability to get access to a notified body and get a timeline for their technical documentation files to get reviewed under the IVDR, that timeline's slipping away. What has happened, though, is there's a couple new notified bodies that have come online. Most notably, we've heard of DNV getting approval to do IVDs now, and I think that is going to help address some of this pain, but the timelines are very long, the costs are very high, and that continues to be a massive pain point for manufacturers, both on the MDR and the IVDR side. I think on the MDR side, I think we still have some challenges with the getting products through the process in a timely manner at a cost, as I said earlier, a cost that is not so prohibitive to manufacturers. What we have continued to see is that manufacturers are now starting to go to other markets before the European market, and that is because there's so much pain associated with the regulatory requirements under the MDR and the IVDR.
Wow. I'm just a layman, so I had no idea about the difficulties some manufacturers have faced with the MDR IVDR regulatory requirements. Segueing into EUDAMED, though, what should manufacturers prioritize as EUDAMED's electronic systems becomes increasingly important?
I think manufacturers need to really prioritize getting their basic UDI DIs in order. There are so many companies, especially those class 1 devices on the medical device side, where their basic UDI/DI is not necessarily in alignment or compliance with the requirements of either the regulations associated with the MDR, the IVDR, or with respect to the organization they're working with, whether that's GS1 or the other two, or other three, I should say. I think also having a update to their quality management system procedure as it relates to the requirements to start reporting into UKCA any adverse events. I think that's a very important thing for them to be doing. And also be working on whatever mechanism they need to use to upload their devices into UKCA in 2026, whether that is if they have a small number of devices doing those uploads manually, or seeing how they can implement a process to upload them automatically or through some other connectivity through a software or such. I think it's really important for manufacturers who have a large number of devices to be looking at getting this started and work through this as soon as possible. It is a slow process. It is a slog if you have to do it individually.
And with EUDAMED, swissdamed is also becoming mandatory next year. What action should companies take now to prepare?
Companies need to be working with their Swiss authorized rep to get this information uploaded into swissdamed. As it stands right now, the Swiss rep is the required, as it stands now, the Swiss rep is the entity that is required to upload the information into swissdamed for all the products that a manufacturer has available for sale in Switzerland. These steps of the Swiss rep are important. Waiting until the end of the timeline will be a massive problem for manufacturers, as their Swiss reps will be overwhelmed with other requests from other manufacturers. So getting started on this as soon as possible, or as soon as possible, is something very important for manufacturers to be looking at.
I can definitely see how important it is to get started as early as you possibly can, for sure. I'm wondering though, would you say you've seen any misconceptions around Swiss rep and swissdamed obligations?
I think one of the misconceptions is that a manufacturer can do the registration themselves in swissdamed, and that is a massive disconnect between what the requirements are and what their thoughts are. So concept does not equal reality in this particular case. Manufacturers need to understand what that requirement is for the Swiss authorized rep to do the registration.
I'm going to abruptly shift over to the UK and ask, what should manufacturers know about UKRP and important requirements for 2026?
Well, don't have a lot here, but one thing I can tell you is that manufacturers definitely need to understand the requirement for registration to be done, the listing of devices, which has to be done by the UKRP. And in addition, also understanding the requirement for reporting incidents to the United Kingdom and the MHRA and how that's done through the UKRP. As we transition into the requirements for the UKCA mark to get put on devices, if that continues to be the pathway that the UK is going to follow, there will be this requirement for the manufacturers to make sure that the devices have a UKCA mark on them. So manufacturers will need to have that UKCA mark on the device, and as soon as that's on the device, the UK responsible person needs to be listed on the device. Now, the importer will not at this point, the importer still doesn't have to be listed on the device labeling, but as part of their requirements and their responsibilities, it will be necessary for importers to check that the UKRP is properly identified on devices that have a UKCA mark. So as this transitions happens, this is going to be a very critical piece for the manufacturers to understand for the UKRP and the importer. Now, all of this might be moot because there continues to be discussions as to how the UK will move forward with the regulatory framework. In the beginning, with Brexit, there was always a discussion that they would remove the ability for manufacturers to rely upon the EU MDR CE mark or the EU MDR self-certification for Class 1 and Class A devices and require a UKCA following what was supposed to be a revised UK medical device regulations. Those revised UK medical device regulations have still yet to be published. And as I said, there's been a lot of questions as to whether that is actually going to happen in that form, and whether manufacturers will be allowed to continue to be on the market in the UK in the future by following compliance with the EU MDR and the EU IVDR. That's still to be worked out.
So when we were at RAPS this year, we got quite a lot of labeling questions from manufacturers who came to our booth. So I want to ask you, what new or updated standards and labeling requirements should they pay attention to in 2026?
Wow, that's a good one. I think the biocompatibility standard update that was released in Q3 of 2025, that's the ISO 10993-1 standard. I think it's really important that manufacturers understand the changes that are with that standard itself. I think manufacturers also should be aware that the ISO 13485 standard has not, in fact, got updated, and in fact, has gone through its 5-year cycle, and there's no plan to update it as of right now. So for 2026, there will be no pending changes to ISO 1345. So that should be a bit of a relief for manufacturers. Other labeling and standard requirements, I think it's a continuation of, for the European Union, the requirement for the unique device identification, or UDI, to be on products, on product labeling, and physically on devices for select products. That implementation process, or the timeline for that to come into play, has passed for most high-risk devices on the medical device side, and for IVDs, that is coming to an end. That transition timeline is coming to an end.
Wow. I'm sure manufacturers listening right now will definitely find that labeling information helpful. Moving on to the USA, what US FDA updates from 2025 should foreign manufacturers be aware of as they plan for next year?
It's not a 2025 change. It's actually a 2024 change, and probably the most critical change. Foreign manufacturers need to be aware that the FDA, as of February 2nd, 2026, will implement their change to their quality system regulations, the CFR Part 820, which have been in place since 1996, I believe, or 1997. And they are replacing them, and for the most part, with the introduction or the acceptance of ISO 13485. Manufacturers now who are going to sell into the United States need to be aware that they need to comply with the requirements of ISO 13485, plus the few remaining requirements of the CFR Part 820, now known as the Quality Management System Regulation, specifically around records. It's probably the most critical one that manufacturers need to be considering. These changes to ISO 13485 2016, this is a compliance requirement. It is not a requirement for you to be certified to the standard, but foreign manufacturers need to be aware of this. There are a lot more things that exist in ISO 1345 than exist in the CFR Part 820. And what I mean by that is, in many cases, manufacturers that were selling in the United States were able to have a quasi-quality management system, maybe just have a procedure for this and a procedure for that. That's not necessarily the case with ISO 1345. I really believe that manufacturers need to be much more considerate of the requirements of ISO 1345. I think another critical topic, it's not an update from the FDA, but it's an update from the US government, is around tariffs and the tariffs that are happening for foreign manufacturers who are trying to bring their products into the United States. As you're planning for 2026, in a previous podcast, we talked about tariffs. I think it's absolutely important for manufacturers to continue to take that into consideration as they are planning for sales into the United States in 2026. I think also as it relates to FDA updates, manufacturers need to be aware that there have been changes within the staffing at FDA, and some priority changes have happened in terms of what needs to get what's the priority for devices to get reviewed. Additionally, foreign manufacturers need to remember that the FDA's establishment registration fees have gone up again as of October 1st, and they do go up every year on October 1st. But the FDA also did take into consideration this year that for companies trying to renew their registration, and hopefully you've already done that, considering the renewal was October 1st, even though there was a government shutdown, that renewal needs to get done. But there are some opportunities for manufacturers who can now point to financial distress and saying that the current fee structure for an establishment registration, which is over $11,000 US, is difficult for them, and they can request that fee be reduced based on financial concerns of the company. So that's something for foreign manufacturers to take into consideration. And also foreign manufacturers should, of course, always remember that if they have a registration, or a 510K submission or a 513G device classification submission or pre-market approval application, that there is an opportunity for those manufacturers that are located outside the United States to still apply for the small business determination, which means a small business discount, which can mean up to a 75% reduction in the fees for such things as 510K submissions and PMAs.
A lot of useful information there. And if you haven't checked out Darryl's previous episode where we discussed tariffs and the effects it can have on manufacturers, please do as we go more in depth. Well, to end this episode, I want to lastly ask you, if manufacturers could focus on just one strategic priority to stay ahead in 2026, what should it be?
This is a very good question. I think it depends on whether you're a medical device or an IVD, and looking at the MDR and the IVDR for Europe. If you are a medical device and you have not transitioned to the MDR as of right now, you're running out of time quickly. It's absolutely imperative that you get this done in 2026. You need to get a notified body. You need to get that process started and finished in 2026. That might mean switching notified bodies to a notified body that has more availability. If you've been a transitional device and up until now, you've had some, you've been continuing to move forward without completing that transition to the MDR. If you haven't had that conversation, I know you have an agreement with them already to continue to be a transitional device, but it's absolutely critical that you get that started, get that ball rolling. And if you don't, your notified body will run out of time. You will run out of time, and you may have to switch to a notified body that has more availability in their time slots. I think on the IVDR side of it, again, the timeline is so important, and so many manufacturers have so many technical documentation files. There are many, many, many companies who have more than 25 or 50 technical documentation files that need to get reviewed by the notified body. Time is running out. We've talked about this many times. MedEnvoy in presentations, notified bodies in presentations, and other consulting firms have spoken to the fact that timelines have been falling away, and there's very little time left for you to transition to the MDR and the IVDR. The time has come to get this finished and get it done now. If those are not issues for you and you are only selling into the United States, if you haven't got your transition plan done for the transition to ISO 1345, get that finished in 2025. I know there's only a few weeks left. Get that done in January if you haven't got it done, and start that transition, because February 2nd is coming very quickly.
And that wraps things up for the last episode of the year. I want to thank you, Darryl, so much for joining us again this time around and giving our listeners insight for what has occurred this year and what to watch out for in 2026. Thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. And if you have any questions, shoot us an email at meg-marketing@MedEnvoyGlobal.com. Until next time, stay informed and stay compliant. Bye, guys.